Amen. Well, grab a Bible, guys. We are excited to be together tonight. We're going to be in the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Tonight we continue our study, making our way in the Old Testament, making our way through the Bible about a chapter at a time. And so making our way through a chapter in Ecclesiastes tonight, hoping that God would take his word and speak it to you. Hoping you brought a Bible. And if you didn't, there's Bibles right in front of you, and the chairs in front of you. You can grab page number on the screen. You can use an electronic device. If you want to follow along in a Bible app, that works as well, but we are longing that you would do so that God would speak to you through his word. If you're joining us in the overflow or online, same invitation. Grab a Bible, join us, and may it be that God would just speak to us tonight through his word. I want to lead you in prayer and just ask that God would help us and help us to hear and understand what he has for us. And as we do that, I'm going to lead, but I'm hoping you're praying as well, that you would ask that God would make himself heard and known to you in just a real way tonight. Father, we thank you. Thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for your word. In a confusing world, it's good to have that which is solid. It's good to have that which you said, if we would know it, if we would know your truth. Jesus, you told us if we had that and know that and walk in it, we would be freed and brought into the life you would have for us. And Lord, I believe that. And I believe your word is good. And it would work good into our lives if we would hear it from you this evening. So God, in your great capability, in your kindness, in your mercy, in your grace, would you take your word and just implant it in our hearts, giving us understanding, but just sowing even into our hearts that seed of truth that would be just effective in continuing that transformative work in Christ. Pray for those who don't know you, that even tonight they would see that and come to you. And Lord, we certainly trust you as a God who is at work in these things, and we're asking that this moment right now would be met in your power and your favor. We trust it to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. The Bible calls you and I that since we've been raised to a new life with Christ, if you're a follower of Jesus, that you're to set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits in the place of honor at God's right hand, to think about the things of heaven and not the things of this earth. If you're reading with us through the Bible, you read that today. We as a church are reading through the Bible, and today you were in Colossians 3 and putting the New Living Translation up there because I like the way it just worded it in this phrase. It says, so here's the thing. If you're a follower of Jesus, because you're a follower of Jesus, you've been made alive. You've been made alive in him. We're raised to a new life with Christ, and he invites us to make sure we see that we set our eyes on those realities, that our real life is eternal. It's with Christ. It's where Christ is at the right hand of the Father. And he just invites us and tells us that we are to be a people who think about that we think not about the things of earth, setting our mind not on the things of earth, but on the things of heaven. What hope there is there. What incredible the hope is in what's sometimes been called the long or forever tomorrow. That it's meant to meet you tonight. That reality of heaven, that reality of what's coming is meant to be something that just holds us and secures us. But here's the problem. We have a world that many, maybe even most, don't actually believe that. They don't actually believe there is a heaven or there is a hell, and they don't understand where that is. In fact, they look at life as if this is all there is. So God does this amazing thing. The book of Ecclesiastes is a biblical philosophical book that challenges right into that space. And Solomon begins it, if you've been with us so far, and he says, okay, well, let's just make that our perspective. Let's look at life under the sun. That phrase used throughout this book, it's an invitation to say, okay, what if we leave out God? What if we leave out heaven? What if we leave out hell? What if we believe what so many people say they believe, that this is all there is, that this is life, this is where it is? And so Solomon says, what would make that? Is there hope there? Is there meaning? Is there purpose? Is there anything found? And the conclusion that he states from the very beginning of the book is there is not. He says you do this. You leave God out. You leave out heaven. You leave out hell. It is vanity. It is vanity of vanity. It's emptiness. It's a shadow. It's a chasing after the wind. It does not work. Now, that's a powerful reality, and all the way through the book, that's what we're pressing. That's what we're looking to. So let me say it at the outset one more time. Maybe you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus yet tonight. This is meant to meet you where you are. If you are one of those who would believe this and think, well, I just kind of think this is all there is. This book is meant to expose the utter emptiness of that and show you how that doesn't work and invite you to a relationship with Jesus. But if you know Jesus, it doesn't make this ineffective. The problem is, even though we are supposed to live in light of the long tomorrow and this heavenly understanding, so often we find ourselves really diving into the same way of looking at life in a way that seeks to find meaning and hope and help in a world that Solomon says you're not going to find it. That if you look at this world honestly, without the perspective of heaven and hell, you're going to find an emptiness is existing here. And that's helpful. It's helpful because in one sense, if that's not something you know, it'd be surprising. But if you know this, you're going to go, of course I know that. That's why I need Jesus. It's why I need the hope that's in him. But it's still meant to meet us and help us walk in the midst of that. So we've covered a lot in the first 6 chapters so far that has taken through the survey of that, the search for that, showing its emptiness and just the way it's broken. This chapter and the next chapter, well, it comes as an idea of almost bringing wisdom into this life, of how we would deal with a world that is vain, how we would look at this world and talk about how we live in a world that is that way. In fact, he's going to use the word almost a dozen times in our chapter here this evening, that this is a better. This is a better way to do life. This is a better way to kind of deal with these things here. And so it's going to come across that way. There's a bunch of realities within this chapter, and it's a little bit proverbial in the sense that we're going to cover a bunch of things that are almost just truths that intersect our broken world and this broken life, and they're going to help us, hopefully, just be able to navigate life better. That life under the sun, life in a world that's vain, that is empty in its just confused nature, and how we would walk through this in a way that would say, hey, this is a better way to do life. This is a better way to handle those things. And so that's going to be our approach this evening. We're going to look at a number of things that fall into this, a place where we look and say, okay, in a vain world, there just are better ways to handle it. Well, with that, let's begin there in verse 1 of chapter 7. And he says it this way, a good name is better than precious ointments, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Hey, pause there. And in these first 4 verses, he's going to tell us that it's better to embrace. It's better to embrace this reality that death is a part of our world. Hey, let's work through the verses and we'll talk a little bit about it. He says it again there in verse 1. It's a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of one's death than the day of one's birth. A good name, the idea of your character, really in so many ways determines just the way that your life both progresses and ends. It's kind of simple, but just think it through with me. On the day of your birth, you were born. There was nothing that embraced that as a moment of character or a moment of, hey, you're doing well. You just were born. The only, it says that what makes the day of death better is that you have this possibility of living a life that is marked by character. And he invites us to this. He invites us into a place of saying, that I want to end this thing well. That I want to gaze at this moment and I want to reach that moment in a way that to have a good name, to end your life with a mark of, hey, that your life was lived well. Your life was lived in a way that was just a blessing and right. He says that's a space that we're being invited to get. The reality is this: you're going to die. You're going to die. You're going to reach the end of your life. Or Jesus is coming back in the rapture, 6 one, half dozen of the other. Either way, we're done. Your life here is going to come to a conclusion. And the biblical admonition is to finish well, that we want to say, hey, I want to, run my life to the end of it. Paul would view it as this place of seeing your life and wanting to finish the race well. So that when we reach the end of that space, it's marked with a place of, I lived ready for this. I lived in a way that my life was marked by that. And it's a space that you and I are being invited to recognize in the midst of this. With that, he adds in verse 2, he says, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. He says it's really good. It's really good to go to funerals, to go to places where you go and get to be a part of watching people's lives and how it ended. And those spaces are good because it reminds us of something, that we're all going to die. To be honest, I almost will never do a funeral without quoting this verse of just saying, hey, I'm glad you're here, but the reason we're here is because your day's coming. I mean, what you're seeing is what's right in front of you. What you're seeing is in the midst of this. And so he's telling us that we are meant to be those people that gaze at that and are reminded of our mortality, are reminded of the shortness of our life. In fact, he'll add to it in verse 3 that sorrow is better than laughter. For by sad countenance, the heart is made better. And the idea here is not just sorrow generally, but in its context, it's saying, yeah, you go to a funeral, you hang around, you go to the hospital with somebody who's dying, and you're there. And there's moments where that just is heart-wrenching, where it brings sorrow, where it brings just the recognition of what's happening in those moments. But he's saying it can do good. It can do good in us. So he says, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the fools is in the house of mirth. So one of the things that he's talked about already in the book of Ecclesiastes is that death is one of the great levelers of life. That if you can look at it and recognize everybody dies. I mean, we know what's happening after that. Jesus tells us if you're a follower of Jesus, to be absent from the body, we're going to be with the Lord. That's great. But the book of Ecclesiastes says from this under the sun, here's what we know is everybody dies. Everybody's heading into that space, and we're invited to make sure we understand that. I think about Moses, who wrote it in the Psalm 90, where he simply said, so teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to understand that we have this limited number of days, and it would create in us wisdom. Hey, if you're a follower of Jesus tonight, death is not supposed to be scary, not to you. I mean, that's what it tells us in Hebrews, that Jesus came and he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. Jesus came to give his life for us, to rescue us, to save us from our sin, to take us into heaven. And he said one of the things it does is it rescues us from the fear of death. And there's a huge reality here that our world is consumed with this. Sociologists and people who study this tell us it drives people when they don't even understand it. They're afraid to die. They're afraid to die. They won't talk about it at times. They won't think about it. But it should not be so for you. Again, if you don't know Jesus, we're inviting you to him because it's coming, and you could find hope there. But if you do know him, the reality is it shouldn't be something that you're afraid to either think about or talk about. The wise living, he says, would be somebody who says, I do that. Can I just make sure I say it in the most practical way? You should go to funerals. I mean, not like people you don't know. Don't show up at somebody's funeral you don't know. That's a little creepy. But, I mean, if you're like someone's, if you hear of a funeral from somebody in your world, hey, you should go. You should go for them, but you should go for you. You should go because you just want to remind yourself, my day's coming. There's going to be one of these for me. If Jesus doesn't come back soon, people are going to gather for me. And it should do that. You should do it in other ways, however that works. You should take a walk in a graveyard. You should go visit people in the hospital who are facing end-of-life scenarios and walk and understand, hey, how are you facing this? How does that work? And and those lessons, they communicate things that nothing else really can. And we're meant to. We're meant to be a part of it. And if you're going to live life down here, wow. Death should not scare you. Death should not be something that you never talk about. Death should not be something that you're like, oh, see no evil, hear no evil. You're like, I don't even want to think about it. But there are people that kind of, it is an off subject. Like, we don't talk about that. It should be. Like, you should actually be thinking, when I die, I want it to be like crossing a finish line. I want to end well. I want to run the race that is set before me, and I want to cross that thing with a way that people would say, hey, well done. Like that person lived well, and I'm not afraid of that. I embrace it. And that reality all by itself helps us live. I mean, it's a crazy thing just to recognize how often people live their lives without an understanding of something that is so certain. I mean, really, you've heard it, right? I mean, there's nothing so, sure as death and taxes. But some people get out of taxes. Nobody's getting out of death. Nobody. I mean, there's not anybody here tonight that you're like, well, that's I don't have to worry about that. It's not really something that's in my future. It is in your future. And so living that way changes things. And Solomon's telling us, hey, this would be a better way to live if you saw this, if you saw the reality of death. And again, for us, we understand. That gives us the hope that we need to know what happens after I die. What is that going to look like? And it draws us again to our need of Christ. Well, leaving that continuing, not only is it better to embrace death, he tells us it is better to hear and to embrace rebuke. It's a little bit tied to what we just talked about, but he says it's better to hear rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like crackling of thorns under a pot, so is laughter of the fool. This is also vanity. Like this is emptiness. This is a dumb way to live. So surely oppression destroys the wise man's reason, and a bribe debases his heart. He says it's better. It's better to allow things that are going to make you uncomfortable, like going to funerals, or having people speak into our world that sometimes just challenges what we believe and how we do. I kind of hope that's what's happening tonight. I mean, I hope that I'm speaking some things, you're like, man, that's just a little uncomfortable to think about. Well, sometimes it's good to think about things that are uncomfortable. He says it's much better than that, than hearing a song of fools, than living your life in a space that you only, tell me sweet things, tell me, sweet little lies, tell me those things that only make me happy. And he says that's the kind of thing. He says if you do that, it's going to be this place that this laughter, that it's oppression, that it's bribes, it's found in all the things where people would just be saying, hey, trying to win you over and flatter and move in the midst of that. He says that destroys, that debases, to be in a place that you avoid anything that makes you uncomfortable or makes you think or makes you wonder about things. He says, no, we ought to embrace that. Again, I like the way the New Living Translation kind of paraphrases this. It says it's better to be criticized by a wise person than to be praised by a fool. It says it's so much better to be like, okay, just tell me, speak to my face, tell me the truth. It'd be better to put myself in that kind of relationship than to have people just flatter me and say things that aren't going to really help me. To live life well is to live life where you're not afraid of that, where you're not afraid of having things and people would speak to you in ways that hopefully are helpful. So we embrace death. We embrace rebuke if we're going to live in a world that is vain and hard in the midst of things. And then he just simply talks about patience. Again, it's a little bit contextual, and so you can think about how it even flows into this idea of how we end our lives. It says the end of things is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. So again, there is just a theme. You saw it at the beginning. You had to choose the day of one's death over the day of one's birth, and to say, I want to go this way. I want to be patient. I want to be this place where the end is better than the beginning. We can spend a bunch of time talking about it, but you actually know it's true. People can begin poorly and end well, and that changes everything. You think about somebody just in a race who, launches off the starting blocks poorly, and they stumble, but they pick it up and they end well. That's glorious. That's glorious. It's terrible when it's the other way around. When somebody starts so well and then ends so poorly. He says it's so much better to be aware of how that progress is going, that you want to end. You want to see things go in a way that is altogether good and right. So he tells us, that end is better, that seeing it and saying, okay, there's a way of doing that, which is also hopeful, by the way. If you have stumbled, if you have got off the starting block slow, and you're like, man, the end is still before you. You can still pick up the pace. You can still say, I want to end well. I want to end as a godly person. I want to end as someone who's doing well. I want to go in those ways. And so he calls us to patience. He says the end of things is better than its beginning, the patient in spirit rather than the proud in spirit. To be patient, to endure, not just emotionally, but to stand in things and not in arrogance and pride, fight against that. It's a very different way of doing life, and we could literally probably spend the rest of the evening right there. But I'll just give it enough and say, hey, these two things stand in contrast. Being prideful and arrogant and the world about you, or being patient and just enduring. It says if you're going to do that well, you're not going to become someone that's explosive. You're not going to become someone that he says or hastens in your spirit to be angry, because anger rests in the bosom of fools. James would tell us, so my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. It's pretty simple. It's it's not one of these things that you probably are like, man, I never thought about that. No, you probably have. You've probably heard this before. But it's worth thinking through. Hey, you know what? Be slow. Be slow to let anger boil up. There's a righteous anger. There are things that should make you angry, but you should not get there quickly. It should be a well-processed. If you are going to be righteously angry, it's a well-thought, well-processed. So you be slow. You be slow to get there. And he just simply says, because if we do the anger of man, that'll never do the righteousness of God. And to me, that's one of those incredibly helpful and seriously convicting realities. That anger will never create that just exploding at somebody, it'll never actually do that righteous thing. And so he says, hey, don't do it. You don't want to do this way. That's so much better. If you're going to look at life and you're going to say, okay, we're going to deal with things. We're dealing with a fallen world. We're dealing with fallen people. Be better to be patient. Be better to take the long view of things and endure through the midst of things, because in so many ways, it is helpful. So death, rebuke, patience. And the next verses kind of flow off of it, but I'll just say it this way. Better to embrace today. Today, yeah, that's what he says. He says it this way in verse 10. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Okay, I quickly pause and say some of you would know, because one of my favorite quotes, ties into this. Jim Elliot simply had said, this way, wherever you are, be all there. It's one of those quotes that grip me and work in me and continue to shape my life to this day, and I recognize how rarely we are. That he's saying, okay, if you're going to do life, one of the keys of that is to be present in the moment. There's actually no other place you can live. There's no other space that you can be a part of. And the only space to really live is in the present. And yet, few people do. Most people either live in the past or the future, live either in regret over yesterday or anticipation over tomorrow, and fail to live in the moment. And so he speaks a couple of things into this, and one of them is the one there where he says, do not say, why were the former days better than these? That's just a really great way to say it. Don't say it. Don't be one that says that. Don't be the person that says, oh, the good old days. Those were the good old days. Those were better days than today. As if somehow they were. He says that's not wise. It's not wise. Why? For 100 reasons. One, you're not actually a really good judge of that. Most of us, the good old days, are a mixture of forgetfulness and just a vivid imagination. I mean, we kind of look and think, hey, wouldn't it be better? And sometimes we even look at our world and we'll think, man, it would have been so much better, 50 years ago. And I just want to tell you, the Bible's really clear. 50 years ago, People were broken, and everyone was a sinner, and sin was destroying our world. And it's the same thing that's happening today. Yeah, it's different in different layers and different spaces, but it's a terrible place to live in this place where you're thinking through, like, I wish we could have yesterday, whether it would be, as a nation, or it be you as your life, that you would wish away your present, that you'd live just thinking, I loved my college days, I loved my, young married days, I loved whatever those were. Those are not the days you're in. The simple reality is you live today. Today is where you are. And he invites us to see that. In fact, he'll say it this way, that as we think about how that works and how it plays out, he says in verse 11, wisdom is a good inheritance and profitable to those under the sun. Wisdom is a defense, as money is a defense. But the essence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. So he's inviting us into this place of not being foolish like the previous verse, but saying, hey, we could be wisdom, you could walk in wisdom. It's this place where it gives a good inheritance, where it gives profit to it, and he just wants to reason with us that it's better than money. It just makes sense to one person. Maybe you're someone who does that well. You have a savings. You have a cushion that you say, okay, this is how, if tomorrow goes bad, we have something, to rely on. We have something that we could fall back on. He says that's how many of us live our life. Wisdom's better than that. To be able to handle life well, it is more of a reserve that says, hey, if things go weird and things go weird in our world, I fall back on this. I fall back on that which is true and God's wisdom and his ways that help me navigate this weird and broken world, this space that can be difficult. In fact, let's just add to it there in verse 13. It says, consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? This isn't a give up kind of attitude, but there is a space of just recognizing there are things that are way outside your control. There are things outside of your control in our world. There are things outside of control in our lives, and so much of it you don't get to choose. I don't think any one of you got permission before COVID happened. I don't think you're like, hey, somebody asked me, hey, do we want to go through one of the weirdest spaces we could ever go through? Nobody asked us. We didn't get to choose it. We didn't get to, even if you, however you thought about it, embraced it or didn't embrace it, it didn't change what was happening in the world. You can be in the spaces where tornadoes are happening and hurricanes are happening, and you look at a world that is much outside of your control. And he says, so how do you change that? How do you look at a world that's broken and fractured? And it's fractured all the way around us. He says, you can't change it. You can't make it right. So he just reasons with us this way. In the day of your prosperity, verse 14, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider, surely God has appointed one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. It's a pretty simple understanding, and yet worth our just quickly thinking about it. Who doesn't like good days? I mean, who doesn't like it? We like it when everything's good, when the sun is up, not this hot, but when it's we're enjoying it, our health is good, and it just is a good day. We like good days. We should be joyful in those. But when they're not those days, and there are days outside of your control, there are days that either our world or your body or something's happening, and they're just not as much fun. It is one of those days that you'd sit there and say, this is not one of those fun days. But here's the reality. God is working in our world. He's promised to work everything together for good. He's doing things that we don't understand, and he's just inviting us, live in this moment. The propensity to live in the past is often regret. Sometimes it was good days that we thought. Sometimes we live in the future because we hope the days will be better, but this is the only day you got. Like right now. This is the day you get to live in. Some days are really fun, and you should be absolutely present. Some days are not as much fun, but you should be absolutely present. God's doing things. He's working in the midst of it, and even on the days that aren't fun, there's no better space for you to just walk in than being, hey, this is where I am. This is the world I'm in. This is the reality right now. I could pretend it's not. I could wish it away. I could hope it away. But this is where I am. And so I should embrace that. I should accept one as well as the other, not because, necessarily that all of it's good or even trying to figure it out, but just believing that God's working in the midst of it, and it simply would invite us there. It's a powerful reality, and I'm trying to think about how to say it better. There's a bunch of people in our world that because they're struggling with this, they'll spend all their days, hiding from it. Some will hide through it with drugs. Some will hide through it with alcohol. Some will hide through it with books. Some will hide in a movie. And it'll just be like, hey, this is how I handle a world I don't like. This is how I handle the days I don't enjoy. But the problem with any of those things, it only makes it worse. It doesn't fix any of the problems. And the problems are either same when you come out of that little space you're in or worse. So much better just to say, okay, it's not my fun day. I don't like it, but God, I'm gonna walk in this moment. Yeah, it's a broken world. Yeah, it's got lots of things, but this moment is the moment that I get to live in. And for you as followers of Jesus, it's the place that God promises to meet you. He uses terms like abide with me, walk with me. He uses terms that are present tense terms that would say, we get to have this present relationship with Jesus. And one of the crazy things is that's the only place where God really meets you. Maybe, again, it's just for me, but it's been one of those spaces that I've been aware that, sometimes it's just trying to, search for God or trying to hear His voice, and my mind's somewhere else. I'm either thinking through the past or I'm thinking the future, and when I finally get down to like, okay, today I just want to walk with you, God. Like today, like right here in this moment, it's His voice is there. I mean, He's a God who meets us, who walks with us in the moments and invites us there. It's where He promises to meet you. And so wisdom is, again, just saying, hey, today, just to be able to say, hey, we can't figure any of that out, but today I get to just walk with Him. And so Solomon just tells us, hey, that's a good space for us to do. Okay. Death, rebuke, patience today, living in this moment. Then he adds to it this, what we'll call in verses 15 to 18, balance. It's probably not the best way to say it, but hopefully it'll be helpful. He says it this way in verse 15, I have seen everything in my days of vanity. Like this is a crazy world, and it is chasing after the wind, and it's empty. I've seen it all, Solomon says. There's a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in wickedness. It is actually one of the most troubling realities. Maybe you've thought it through, and maybe you haven't. Sometimes the righteous die young. And sometimes the wicked live long lives. Sometimes the righteous struggle with sickness all their days. And sometimes the wicked have health. It's not a universal thing. It's not all righteous suffer, all wicked don't. But it certainly doesn't work the way sometimes we think it would work. And I don't know how much you've wrestled with this. I don't know how much you've actually let just this, because it is a weird part of our world. Broken, like, okay, it doesn't work that way. Like I would assume, like somebody who's good and godly, like they'll live long lives and be blessed. And then sometimes they just don't. You get Stephen, you get, some of the disciples are like, man, how come that? How come that happens that way? I find myself thinking of Psalm 73, and we won't have time to go there, but it's definitely one, if you're struggling with this, I would offer you that psalm. Asaph, the writer of the psalm, says that's what he was struggling with. It was an internal struggle as he just looked out there and said, hey, it doesn't work this way. Like, I don't understand, like, why is it happening this way? And God is able to meet him. And God is able to meet him. And the answer in Psalm 73 is the long tomorrow. It's, hey, this isn't the end of the story. This isn't the end of the story. If you think it is, then we get to see heaven. We get to see hell. So I want to tell you there's hope in that. There's hope in that, and I'd give it to you in Psalm 73. But here, this is not the space that Solomon's talking about. He's just saying, hey, if we're going to live in a world that is unfair, where these things are there, how do we handle this? How do we walk? Well, he tells us this in verse 16. Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? Okay, think this through with me for a moment. Let me make this really clear, and I hope you can hear it. So, yeah, he's saying, okay, on one hand, don't be overly wise, and in another sense, don't be overly foolish. Now, this sounds almost like some Eastern, proverbial mysticism, like, hey, just don't be too much on anything. But that's not what it's saying. It's not what it's saying. How do I know that? Because he's going to tell us how you can escape this. He says it this way in verse 18, it is good if you grasp this, and you do not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. So he's not here saying, hey, just be a little bit bad and a little bit good. Don't be too good. That's not obviously what he's saying. He's saying if you'll fear God, you'll rescue yourself from two really dumb ways to live. So what are the two dumb ways? Well, one of them is the idea of being overly wise. And there is this legalistic self-righteousness, asceticism, this works-based life that is seeking to earn something. It is seeking to say, hey, if I'm really, really good, can I get success? Can I get long life? If I beat myself, if I deprive myself of things, is there some kind of quid pro quo that I do this and God will give me more? And he says that's a dumb way to live your life. It doesn't work this way down here, and yet there's a people who are striving to gain something in this world that it doesn't work that way. On the other hand, there are those who are just overly wicked. If we could say it that way, they're dumb. They live foolish lives, just kind of self-destructive lives. Just look at it and think, hey, what does it matter? And they live in this space that is dangerously self-destructive. And that can be true in the way they do their life or even the heart behind it. And so he's just saying, hey, these are dangers. And some of it is because the world is broken and it's unfair. And how you process that is going to be problematic. And really, even here this evening, probably some of you fall on one of these sides or the other. Either you're like, I'm working really hard. Like I'm praying and I'm reading my Bible and God's he's gonna bless me for and make me live longer, and it's gonna go longer because I'm working really hard, and you somehow have this weird thing that you think is working. It doesn't work well for you. And then somebody else is here this evening and you're just like, man, it doesn't even matter. I'm reckless. I don't even try to take care of my body. I don't try to, be healthy because what does it matter? And it's like, what a dumb way to live. He says, how do you rescue from people who look at this unfair world? He says, if you fear God, it'll rescue you. If you recognize there is a God and he's good and he's working, even though you don't understand everything here, it'll rescue you from two places that can be incredibly destructive. And he just simply says, it is good for you to grasp this in verse 18 and not remove your hand from the other. Like, don't be crazy trying to earn God's favor or reckless, but if you fear God, it'll help you escape. It'll work good. And that's how the book's going to end, by the way. Ecclesiastes ends, and the final verse is saying, fear God. Like, there is a God. Live your life in light of him, and it'll help you rescue from all of this. So good space is just to think through, kind of thinking through a space that would say, hey, there is a good balance in the way that would say, okay, I'm not trying to earn God's favor, but neither am I trying to be reckless. I'm just enjoying the life that he's given and saying, God, as much as you give me, I want to live it for you. And there's a good way of doing that he says would be helpful in a world that is vain, in a world that is broken. Okay, well, we have one more. And again, it's kind of proverbial, so we've been moving through a number of things. We've definitely talked about death, rebuke, patience today, balance, living in the midst of it. The final section really deals with the depravity of man, of just recognizing how sinful, how broken our world is, and living in light of that. It would say it this way, in verse 19, wisdom strengthens the wise, more than 10 rulers of the city. Like, hey, there's strength found in wisdom. What kind of wisdom? Verse 20, for there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. The Bible's really clear about this. Everybody's a sinner. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, it tells us in Romans. Like, we are sinners. We are sinners by nature. We are born sinners. And we are sinners by choice. And everybody is. Maybe you believe that. Maybe you're here tonight and you're like, hey, I totally like that. I believe that. But maybe you're also aware of not everybody does. It's not the way everybody lives their life. Some really do believe. I mean, they look at kids and they'll say, hey, kids are like this blank slate. They come into this world and they're innocent and they're just good. And the Bible's like, actually, they're selfish sinners. Who are, just don't have they live there. It's already in this space. People have this propensity of looking at people and thinking, what's the culture that messes people up? It's the education system. It's something else. And yet the Bible would tell us that we get to look out and say, no, we're all broken. Every one of us. Every person in this world. There is no one righteous. There's not one. There's not anybody in this world that is not struggling with sin, and let's even bring it in more closely. There's not anybody in this room. There's not anybody in this room. You are sinners. You are ones who struggle with it and fight against it. If you know Jesus, you're forgiven, but we still have this old nature hanging around, and we would look at this and say, hey, there's nobody. There's nobody who's doing good and does not sin. There's nobody out there that is that way, and that can be helpful. But the problem is we just don't always really believe it. I think about it. A.W. Tozer said a man can believe in total depravity and never have any sense of it, at all for himself at all. Like never really think through, well, okay, I actually believe this, and it changes the way I see myself. And it changes the way I see people because I know this. I know this. He's inviting you and I to that. So what would that look like? Well, he gives us an example. Verse 21. Do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you, for many times also. Your own heart has known that you have cursed others. So here's this thing. It shouldn't be shocking. It shouldn't be shocking when you hear somebody speaking unkindly or cursing, speaking just wrongly about somebody. I mean, here's what we know. I think about what it tells us in the book of James, that we all stumble in many things. But if anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect man. He's able to bridle the whole body. If you could just control your tongue, you would be amazing. If you could, and yet James tells us is you cannot. There's not one person in this room that's like, oh, that's not my problem. And it's like, it is a problem. Your tongue gets you into trouble. Sometimes you say things you should not say. Sometimes you say things to people or about people that you should never say. And I like the way he says it. He says many times, if you're honest, many times you know you've done it. Because you know why? Because you're a sinner. Because you are struggling with taming this uncontrollable tongue. But if you believe that about yourself, you'll believe it about others, and it wouldn't be that surprising. He says, so if you hear somebody say it, don't take it to heart. Don't let everything somebody say make you angry or bitter or frustrated or disappointed and think they're bad people or we all are, I guess, in a sense. But in that sense that you're just not going to be surprised. It should be one of those things like, I know my own self. I know my own struggle. And so I'm not surprised that I live in a world that is this way. And what grace there would be found here if we just believed this. If we, gave each other a little bit like, oh, you're probably having a hard day. It's not the normal thing that flows out of your mouth. And if it was, then we'd have a different conversation. But you know what? I'm also aware. I'm aware of how broken people are. I'm aware that we're all broken. And so it's not going to surprise me that you're broken. It's not going to surprise me that you have a bad day or say something that you shouldn't say. And I hope you kind of feel that. I hope in one sense you come in here this evening and you find this to be a space where we're speaking truth and where grace is found. Grace for people like you. Because sometimes people come into church and think, man, these people, they're just all good. They probably never say anything. They never lose their temper. They never say something unkind. And you sit here and think, I'm the only one. No, you're not. You are broken. And so are we. And yet that should change the way you deal with it. It's a weird thing that even though we are so broken ourselves, sometimes it happens. Somebody has a bad day and they say something really unkind. It's cutting. And then we just cut them off. Like, I can't believe they'd say that to me. I'm never talking to them again. Like, I am never going to go to church with them. I can't believe they would do that. What a weird world we would live in where that would be us. Instead of when saying, hey, love covers a multitude of sins, we come into this place and recognize we know what we are. And we know what we expect, so it's not going to surprise us that that's what we deal with. It's not going to surprise us that we're living in a world that is this. And so he's telling us, hey, we should know that. Add to it, he tosses in a few things. He says, all this I've proved by wisdom, and I said, I will be wise. But it was far from me. Simply said, he said, so I thought, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be wise. And he said, well, I couldn't do it. It's like I thought about trying not to, lose my temper or say something I shouldn't say, and I found out that I was unstoppable. That I couldn't choose in that sense not to do that. He says, as for what is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out? Like, who could even understand it? I applied my heart to know, to search out and seek wisdom and reason of things, to know wickedness and folly and foolishness and madness. And he's saying he can't. Again, I don't have a bunch of time, so I just want to try to say this quickly. Sin just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't. It just doesn't. If it was just rational, if it was always like, why would I want to do that? We would never sin. I don't know where you are. I don't know honestly where you are, but I can honestly, hey, you know what? Like, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to hurt God and hurt people? I don't want to do it. And yet we still struggle because our sinful nature is there. And he says there's something about it that you just look on this and think, the brokenness of our world that is creating the vanity that's in us it's unreasonable. It's not like something that you could just argue it away. Maybe some of the parents here tonight would know this better than others, because I wonder if you thought at some place, hey, if I just sit down and explain to my kids why they shouldn't do it, that they'll just be good. They're just going to be good. They're totally, if I just explain, why they shouldn't do that. I mean, once they get it, they'll be, and he's like, and then you sit there and have this conversation, like, why did you do it? I don't know. Why'd you hit your sister? I don't know. Just there. And you're like, I'm just trying to understand. And it's like, well, I don't even know why I did. I just did, and you're like, and you try to think, can we just fix this? And no, you cannot fix it. You're living in a world that is broken and unknowable in that and unreasonable. And he says, okay, that's not what we're going to find. That's not how this is going to work out. So it's not surprising that it's that way. It's not surprising that sin and how it works in people's lives is that, in one sense, like we expect it to be that way. Well, leaving that, adding to it, verse 26, he says, I find more bitter than death a woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. He warns of being ensnared. So we live in a broken world and people are broken. Everybody's broken. But some, they're not just struggling, they're trapped. Their sinfulness is now become that which is destructive. The Bible tells us, hey, be careful who you make friends with, because, foolishness corrupts all of us. Walking with people in those spaces becomes dangerous. And so there's this place of recognizing, hey, there are some who they will pull me and trap me and pull me into sin. He uses this picture of almost a harlot that would, kind of entrap somebody, but it's a bigger picture than that. If you can understand it this way, it's true of everything in life. There are choices that you would make that would say, hey, I just recognize, hey, there's a bunch of sinful people, and if I don't choose correctly, it's going to pull me off course. There will be people who will be trapping. They will be ensnaring. There will be those who do that. And yet he just tells us, he who pleases God will escape. Yeah, like you can get out of some of those places. Like you live for God, but the sinner's going to be trapped. It's going to be trapped by that. Think about how it tells it to us in the book of 1 Corinthians. No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man. But God is faithful. I will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. It says that we're living in a broken world, so we're exposed to things that would entrap and pull us down, but God is good. He is good, and he will work in a way to not allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able. He'll make a way out, and the way out, he says here, is if you're wanting to please God, if you're saying, God, I'm worried about, I want to make you happy. I'm more concerned for that than other things. It will be that thing that would bring about an escape. I just want to tell it to you in the most, just again, practical way. Put it to the test. I mean, in those spaces where you feel it, where you feel like something is pulling you, and maybe you're in a friendship or a relationship that you shouldn't be, and you say, God, I want to please you. God, what would make you pleased in this situation? And sometimes it would guide you very, very clearly to navigate away from that which would be destructive, because, again, it's what we're dealing with. We're living with a world that is destructive and harmful, and people who are in those spaces. So he's saying, hey, you're gonna navigate this depraved world where people are that way, and navigating it well requires you to walk in this and recognize, again, how dangerous it is. That, again, just this picture of snares and nets and fetters. I mean, it's meant to be like this place of, boy, I'm walking into a trap. Like I'm walking into something. If I'm not careful, this thing's going to undo me. And he says that's exactly what you ought to recognize and say, God, I want to please you. Here's what I said, verse 27, here's what I found, says the preacher, adding one thing to another, to find out the reason, which my soul seeks, but I cannot find. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among these I have not found. Let's just tack this through for a moment, and let me just be really clear. In our American society, this sounds a little bit dangerous. This sounds chauvinistic. It's not. In essence, what he's simply saying is there's no one good, no, not one, men or women. He says, here's what I've looked. I've looked for somebody. He says, I've looked looked among men and women. He says, one man among 1,000, but I haven't found any, and I've not found any women that way. Let's just take that one man among 1,000 for a second. It isn't kind of like, hey, there's one. It really is one of those phrases in those days. It's like we would say, searching for a needle in a haystack. It's going to be like, hey, you look for one, you're never going to find it. There is none. It is a little bit proverbial in that sense of saying, hey, that's not that. I mean, 1 in 1,000 is terrible odds, right? I mean, could you imagine if I came to you tonight and said, hey, I have an investment opportunity for you. We have a 1 in 1,000 chance that you're going to have any kind of return. Hey, are you in? And I'm hoping you would be like, no, those are terrible odds. I mean, like, there's no way you're going to do that. And so he's saying this. He says, I searched, I haven't found any. But he still uses this phrase of one among 1,000 or among the thousands. And so I just want to tell you, it's not that there are any good people out there. It's not that we had looked there. He already told us that. He already told us that, that there's no one who doesn't sin. It's not that. But there is a glimmer of hope here. And I wonder if you feel it. I wonder if you see it, because I'll just quickly tell you, I know who the 1 in 1,000 is. I know the one among the thousands and millions and billions is Christ. I mean, there's a hope of Christ. There's a hope here that there is one who is good. There's one who would be our rescue, that there would be one who would be in the midst of it. So there's a little bit of a nugget found in the text here that says, hey, we could find one. There's only one. But in a world that's broken, there's none others. I mean, it says, my soul seeks him, I cannot find, and there is none. And so again, Romans would tell us, hey, no, not one. None. There's nobody righteous. There's nobody there except Christ, and yet Christ is our hope. So he gives us this thought, and he ends this chapter kind of in this space where he's talking about this, and he says, God, this isn't God's fault. He didn't make us this way. He says, this only I have found, that God has made man upright. Like you go back to the beginning, like God created Adam and Eve. He made us to be righteous. But he ends it by saying, but they have sought out many schemes. We'd probably say it well from the Isaiah 53. All we like sheep have gone astray. Every one of us, we scheme. Every man, every woman, every child. Our brokenness has worked into our world that we now kind of try to live our own lives, choose our own destinies, make our own courses, and that goes bad for us. And so he's inviting us to see that, to know the hope that is that. In fact, I think about that passage in Isaiah 53 that I'm quoting, where it simply says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So, dealing with the same problem, man, we're all broken. Every one of us are broken. Every one of us is manipulative. Every one of us is scheming. Every one of us is even when we're not realizing we're doing it because that's what our sinful nature does. And so Solomon is telling us that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a world that is this. We're dealing with a world that's where we're broken, and that's true. But I can't help but come back and tell you, but this is what makes the hope beyond Ecclesiastes, above the sun, change everything. If we look at this idea of a broken world and you leave God out and you leave heaven and hell out, it's a pretty dismal place. I mean, honestly, if you could see it, unless you're just going to try to cover it, but if you want to know it, it's broken, and everybody's broken. And everybody's kind of got, we're a bunch of sinners that are just broken in so many ways, and yet the hope that we have through the entire message of the Bible is this is why we need a God. This is why he sent his son. Why the Lord would lay on him, on Jesus, all of our brokenness. That he would look at us and say, man, you are all going astray. We are all that. That's why we need him who came to rescue us, came to be life to us, and came to give us that. And I draw you back to see that again, because the hope in all of it is Christ, that he would be this to us. So we think about what we've talked about tonight, and I just ended here just saying he's telling us in this broken world, there's some ways to do this better than the other. It's still broken. It's still broken. It's still a vain world. It's still dealing with people who are sinners and hard, but there's a better way to do it, and there's some ways to say, okay, I see it, and he gives us some help in that, but it still draws us to the greatest help of all, which is Christ. So I invite you to that. If you don't know Jesus, I'm pleading with you to surrender your life to him. If you do, I'm inviting you to find your help and hope in him and navigating a world that is broken. Let's close in prayer, and then we'll take some time in worship. Father, thank you for your word, and it's just true. I'm glad that you tell us the truth. Sometimes I just walk through it, especially just in passages like we've read tonight. It's not always fun truth. Sometimes it's ugly truth. Reminders of what we're dealing with, and unfairness and brokenness and sin, and that's what we deal with in our lives. Thank you for telling us the truth. But Jesus, thank you that you are the truth. That you are that one who is good. The one who God took our sin and laid it upon. Thank you that the end of the story isn't found under the sun. That our story is to seek those things which are above. Thank you for the hope in that. But would you help us now? Help us to navigate life better. Through the help of your word. We ask for that now. In Jesus' name. Amen.